Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. And welcome back to the Colloquia series on portable X-ray XRF after a bit of a long hiatus that we had there. I would like to thank everyone who has made it through the scheduled change to be here with us in person. And also thank you to all of those who continue to watch the series online and use that as a resource. We're really glad that's been useful for people. Um, so the Colloquia on portable XRF is organized by the European Academy of Science and Arts, and specifically the STEMAC expert group, which Ioannis, who unfortunately cannot be here with us today, is our representative, and also the Global p-XRF Network, which is championed by our dear Vicky here. We would like to say thank you really quickly to Doris Kalinda for her ongoing technical support in organizing this series. I would be a little bit lost without you. She helps us really disseminate all of the information, which is fantastic. So this series continues as a specialized section of the very successful Colloquia Arts Meet Science activity by the STEMEC in Arts and Cultural Expert Group. The goal of the series is to create resources and guidance for the XRF community, provide examples and of applications, and methodologies, and create opportunities for the exchange of knowledge. So I am very lucky to have the honor of welcoming our two speakers, Lucas Martindale Johnson, who is from the University of Nevada, and also Jeffrey Ferguson, who is from the University of Missouri and the Murr Archaeometry Laboratory. Thank you guys so much for being here with us today, for sharing your expertise with us. I will now hand it over really quickly to Nikki, who will introduce our first speaker.
Thank you very much. And thank you to you, Keelie, because she is the main organizer handling all of this, bringing us all together. So thank you very much for that. And I have the honor to introduce our first speaker, which is Lucas Martindale Johnson. He holds a PhD in anthropology of the University of Florida and is currently adjunct assistant professor at the University of Nevada, but also cultural resource program manager within the Department of Defense and the Air Force at Nellis Air Force Base, which I find really impressive and would love to learn more about, but we're in the p-XRF colloquium, so we need to proceed with that. He also was principal investigator previous to that at the p-XRF lab. He is a registered professional archaeologist, which I personally really, really love, and is known in the p-XRF community for his papers on methods, but also XRF in Mesoamerica, Western North America, and Eastern Africa. He currently works with a focus on the Southern Great Basin and at the ancient Maya site of Palenque. I think that was wrongly pronounced, but I just got to run with it. And he continues to train students which have little to no p-XRF experience. It works towards evaluating validity across various XRF instrumentations. And today he's gonna give us a quick run through his workflow on Obsidian analysis with the p-XRF. And with that, I would like to hand over and listen to this exciting presentation.
Thank you very much for that introduction. That was really great. So as the introduction to my talk and my background stated, I do like to assess the validity of different instruments. We're often starting from scratch when we get a new instrument or we're in a new region. And so I had the opportunity of talking with some county museum folks not too long ago, around the time that I was asked to do this talk. And so I wanted to incorporate some of that teaching and some of those methods into this talk and then have a case study to present too. Oh, hang on. There we go. All right. So I'm going to contextualize the talk. I'm going to talk about some key concepts in XRF. These words should be familiar to a lot of folks in XRF: reliability, precision, accuracy, and validity. These are concepts that we all deal with, whether explicitly or implicitly, when we do our analysis and make comparisons. I'm going to define and evaluate standards. We'll test instrument assumptions using a particular instrument, but it's applicable across, any kinds of instruments that we're using in XRF. I'm going to define what an Obsidian source is, certainly in my research, and I'm sure Jeff can reiterate that, and there's other people on the call that will understand that there's different ways to think about what an Obsidian source is. And then approach to sourcing. I'm going to define 3 of them, and then I'll do a little test case of several artifacts from some research I'm doing now. So basically, as we all understand, being part of this community is, we're always connecting with various experiences of users, whether they be very proficient, whether they be neophytes, right, and need a fair amount of assistance. And so we always have to, at least for me, I always have to understand who I'm talking to and who might be asking for information, right? What's their level of knowledge? What do they want to do analysis on? What do they have at their disposal to do work with? And what's their goal? Are they doing conservation? Are they doing research? Are they doing training? Are they doing outreach? All those things might matter in terms of how you want to apply XRF in your lab or your professorship or whatever in the field. What instruments do they have? Because there's different operations and different softwares and different hardware. Even though XRF has been around for a long time, there's still varying degrees of difference that we need to understand. And then who will use it, right? Will it be a professor overseeing students? Will it be somebody who's overseeing them that doesn't know anything about archaeology and the students know more than the professor? All that matters, right? Is it a rotating team of people doing stuff? There's a need to be continuity between different analysts. And then when you do training, right, how do you provide a safe space where you can effectively, do the kind of analysis? So some of these things are incorporated in my presentation, and some of them are not. But I figured it would be important to just discuss as background in how somebody can become trained, or if somebody reaches out to you, some of the questions that are important to ask, or at least they're important for me to ask. And I've learned how important they are by meeting with people and going, oh, you really know a lot, or you really know nothing. And right, so you've got to figure out, do you need 4 days or do you need 1 day? And sometimes 4 days isn't enough to do a training session. So here's some definitions for everybody. Reliability. Again, these are published in various places. Lee Drake has written about this. Ellery Fram has written about this. I've written about these words. So these are just important concepts that are important to remember. Reliability, the ability of an instrument to perform the same task each time you turn it on. Precision, that it does the same thing. And accuracy, that the analysis, the results you get are similar. They should be statistically similar to other analyses that you've done or that you have access to doing comparisons. And then and all that feeds into what is a valid result, right? Are you able to assign an unknown to an Obsidian source in this case, right? Or some group that you're interested in, some geochemical group. And then it's important to understand what standards are. Sometimes we refer to standards as ones that are purchased through international groups that have a wide consensus. Others are standards that we make up on our own, that we get consensus on through interacting in a community such as this. And so it's important to understand that there's, in some ways, 2 different kinds of standards. One can be relatively costly and be purchased, and another one you can derive through research and build that consensus through a community of practice in archaeology in XRF. So some of the statistical methods that I employ when you're assessing the assumptions of instrumentation. So it's always important to understand what an average is, right? You need to scan more than twice to get an average and a standard deviation. So that's built into some of the more complex analytical statistics of understanding every time you turn that instrument on, is it giving you the same number? Is it telling you what you expect? And so I just wanted to go over these so that folks have a sense of they're iterative, right? You need to scan something more than 3 times. You can understand what the standard deviation is. You can understand what the coefficient of variation is, which is basically to what extent do you get a standardized result, right? A zero being no variation at all, which is great. Usually within parts per million of XRF, you might get 1% variation, 2%, depending on the nature of the part per million. It's important to understand that lower elemental concentration can influence the standard deviation, or sorry, the coefficient of variation. So those are important things to understand. Standard error. Sometimes in the literature, I've noticed that the standard error is also confused with the coefficient of variation, which is not the same thing. Standard error is really a measure of how far those points are from a regression line as measured in part per million, from expected to predicted. So I have a little formula up there, and I'll go over some of these statistics from samples I just ran, and I'll describe the conditions of my analyses. And then a systematic error, right? Is your model systematically over or under predicting part per million? And these are important things just to understand before you even start analyzing artifacts, right? This is just testing out to make sure that your instrument is operating correctly and it's doing what you want it to do, right? So you need standards to measure against known and unknown. So we're going to go over these things, but hopefully this list of definitions and steps is useful for the community. So what's an Obsidian source? I wanted to do this really quickly because this impacts how several of us do XRF in the Southwest and in California. This is the Cosa volcanic field in Southern California. You can see from the scatter plot that they are geochemically distinct, but they're relatively isolated in terms of their geological distribution. So ideally, you would want to source an unknown to one of these geochemically distinct locations. But you can see from my little hypothetical scatter plot, those black dots are the artifacts, and they are not within the statistical ellipse, but they're near it, right? So one might say they're from one of these sources, or they're just from this area, right? So there's often times where, and Kathy, who's on the call, we can discuss this at length. Sometimes you just have to say it's from the COSO area because they're so close to one another, but they don't fall within the statistical ellipses. So an Obsidian source can be geologically and geographically defined, and it can also be statistically defined. And so we aim to do both, right? To get the highest precision of where these materials have originated from. But sometimes we're limited by this sort of geographical area because we have limitations in our geochemistry based on artifact size, or maybe it's a slightly different because our artifacts outnumber our sources and we have a lot more artifacts than we do source samples, and so the statistics are skewed towards what the artifacts are saying. Anyway, I just thought I'd bring this up so that folks who see this video don't get worried when they have a dot outside of their source material. They might still be able to source it, but they have a little less confidence, but they still have confidence in the area that it came from. So the archaeological questions can still be addressed. All right, so approaches to sourcing. There is ideally we would want to have everything analyzed on one instrument all the time, right? So all the same models being applied to the source samples, the standards, the artifacts, everything. Another one is we use published data, right? We have an instrument, we have our artifacts, maybe we have our standards, so we know our instrument is operating as we want it to, but we don't have any source rock. And so we look to published data for that. I've worked with a lot of students who have an XRF, who have artifacts, who get standards loaned to them, but they may not have all the source material that they want. And so they're looking towards published data. And then a third method that I've seen employed is you come up with all the statistical groups with your artifacts, and then you send a sample of each one of those groups to somebody else to source. And then you backfill those assignments. I've seen that too. So obviously the first is the most desirable. The second has major limitations. The third one certainly has limitations because you're using artifacts to create groups, which has some problems with it depending on the nature of your artifacts. So these are methods that people might employ, and there's caveats with certainly the last two, making comparisons. And again, these examples will be important when I go over my case study and what I'm trying to do initially, just using what's available, right? And then figuring out what I should do next. So my case study is from Southern Nevada. It is related to my day job, but not directly, at least not yet. So in 2005, several folks published a really great volume on a lot of Obsidian sourcing, artifacts, source material, really comprehensive piece of literature, disclosed all the information about artifacts, about source material, part per million. Everything was really well disclosed, very transparent, very useful for students, useful for me. So my case study has this volume. It has a sample of artifacts from a site that's nowhere near an Obsidian source, which is a great test for measuring the diversity of Obsidian, because you're not right next to an Obsidian source where you can assume everything is from that one source, right? You expect diversity, you expect difference. So I have data from other XRF instruments that I've used that cover this research area. I do have access to the MER standards. And my sample size is 20 artifacts. I rented an Olympus Vanta M. So basically, I'm using things that are relatively easily accessible, that I don't need a lot of money for. I'm not buying an instrument, I'm renting. I'm doing some preliminary field work. This is all in-field analyses. And trying to see, like, can I employ the same methodology for a much bigger sample size and make comparisons to something that's basically, 22 years old now, because the analysis took place in 2002-03 and then the publication in 2005. So here's a sample of the results from the standards. I'm showcasing rubidium here as a scatter plot, but you can see the coefficient of variation is really low. Strontium has the highest, barium has the highest, and some of that is due to the limitations of the instrument, the lower part per million for strontium, but these numbers all give me confidence that the instrument is reliable and that it's relatively precise. Accuracy is another thing. And so here's the standard residuals. Iron has the highest. Barium is relatively high too, and there's explanations for that. Just given the high count of iron, you're going to have some variation. But these are just out of the box, turn the instrument on, analyze the standards, and see how those results align with the known values of that MER set. No slope corrections, no post-processing corrections, no nothing. Because in order for me to do all those slope corrections every time I rented an instrument, I would need those standards every single time. So my hope is that I can just rent an instrument and just, open it up, turn it on, and start analyzing based off of these kinds of understandings of the instrument. So unfortunately, though, the instrument does have a systematic overprediction of part per million for all these standards. So that's a little concerning. I would maybe need to do some corrections to minimize that. Those are fairly high over predictions. So those are things to just understand, right? We're just evaluating if the car can drive in a straight line and if it has the same gas mileage as we hope, right? This is just an analysis of the instrument. So using those assumptions, not changing any variables, not doing any corrections, I'm going to start making some comparisons to that published data from 2005. Here's a strontium barium plot from that study. They identify 5 geochemical groups from an area called the Obsidian Butte Volcanic Center. I have a map of that in the next slide. So my hope is that I can differentiate 5 geochemical groups also. So I took that volume, that 2005 volume, digitized all of the part per million, and made plots myself. So here's a scatter plot of using the same data. I did not use barium because I didn't really trust that the barium in the Vanta was going to give me the same kind of barium that was being derived from an XRF, from a benchtop vacuum XRF 21 years ago used by Skinner in his lab up in Oregon. So I just used the primary, mid-Z elements. Here's variety 1 through 5 labeled. And this is a sample of individual flakes from those varieties that I had access to through that same lab. So you can see that even the samples I have, they're aligning relatively good to something that was published many, many, many years ago, using different instrumentations, using different prediction models. So this gives me some confidence, but you can also see that the niobium numbers are much lower than what it was published. So this is also gives me some pause down here, right? This tells me what's working well and what's not working well. So the Obsidian Butte volcanic field is a relatively it's a pretty complicated area geologically. It's an area of some extinct calderas. There's a lot of erosion and welded tephras with obsidian nodules in them. So the distribution is not like Coso. That's these really nice little calderas. It's very the sources, the geochemical sources overlap spatially. With the Airfield Canyon one, the one in yellow, that's, I believe, is the most utilized source, but it comes from all over the place in this area. So again, when you were sourcing, are we trying to get location in a real specific way, or are we trying to get location in a more of a general way? So this is where that statistical source versus geological source issue is important to understand, because there's a lot of overlap in the geochemistry, geologically and geographically. So here's the sample of artifacts. They look pretty good, aligning with published data from 23 years ago. We can effectively source these using these source comparisons, but you can see, again, the niobium gives me pause, right? There's a lot of overlap between them depending on the combination of elements. And so some of the elements are under-predicted in the model. And these artifacts are 2 to 3 millimeters thick, so we might get some skewness because of the thickness of the artifacts. This was in field at about 6,000 feet. But this isn't a bad result. This gives me some confidence, but I also can understand the caveats that I might need to correct, right? Get some source samples of my own, right? Request them, double check all these results. So basically, can you source artifacts using a rental instrument without any slope corrections at about a 5,000 foot elevation in the field? And your artifacts aren't really that robust; they're relatively thin, and using data from more than 20 years ago. So the answer is yes, but it's important to understand where that might fail, right? Where those results might not work. And I slightly picked these data on purpose because there's other sources in those 20 artifact samples that create some issues in sourcing because of the nuanced geochemistry. So that's where also some of the problems lie, is not just trying to source to one area, but incorporating 15 or so sources. So we do have to seek some answers to the discrepancies that we see in the systematic overprediction in the model, right? Do we need to do slope corrections? We should probably seek our own source material, and we should shoot for internal consistency whenever possible. So basically, that internal consistency is what will happen next, so that I can compare an internal consistency model approach to one where you're using the bare minimum, right? You're using a published volume, you're using a rented instrument, and you don't seek out any of those other resources. So I would expect, as we all would, that the internal consistency is going to give us a lot higher confidence in our ability to source, which will give us a higher confidence in our validity of our results. That's all I have. So I know we have questions sort of at the end, right?
Yeah, we do.
Yes. We'll have a nice big discussion session at the end.
Okay.
So I believe with that, it is now my turn to introduce our next speaker, who is Jeff Ferguson. So for those of you who don't know, Jeff is an associate professor at the University of Missouri, where he has been since 2006. He is also affiliated, and I think, if I'm not wrong, the director of is that right? Of the Archaeometry Laboratory?
The structure has changed a little bit, so faculty are kind of external collaborators.
Yeah.
So it's a new structure.
Collaborators.
So, yeah.
He is an external collaborator with the Archaeometry Laboratory at the University of Missouri Research Reactor, and his research has included various archaeometric approaches to lithic and ceramic artifacts from across the world. His work spans the Western US, Eastern Africa, and stretches all the way also to Japan, which is very cool. Jeff has always had, it seems, an interesting craft production, which has also apparently led him to be a man of 1,000 hobbies, including ceramics and his own flint knapping, which he taught himself, and his own production of obsidian artifacts, which maybe explains or is maybe explained by his own interests in experimental archaeology, human behavioral ecology, and his main research emphasis, which is on compositional analysis of archaeological materials for provenance studies, the main goal of which is to investigate and establish trade patterns and social interaction. His current research focuses primarily on Pueblo occupations in west central New Mexico. And he has very kindly joined us today to discuss spatial modeling of obsidian use and distribution in the American Southwest. Thank you so much, Jeff. I give the floor to you.
All right, thank you. Let me see if I can get this screen correct here. I think I'm going to share the Zoom screen first and then see if this, is that working?
Nothing happening so
Did I
far.
lose everybody?
Yes, I see nothing so far.
Oh man, I thought I had this worked out. Okay, let's see if I can close that.
Every time you believe that you do, Zoom.
Yeah, it's we tried it out earlier, so let me try again here. So I'm going to try screen 2 and share.
Ooh,
Okay, you can see that screen. Is that different than it was before, at least?
Well, we
Yes.
see something now.
Okay.
I believe I see your desktop now.
Do you see the talk?
No.
Not yet.
Okay.
Now
It's
we
here.
do.
Oh, there it is. There it is. There it is. Just took a
Okay.
second.
You got it? You see in the slide change here?
Yes, we
Okay.
saw
Yes.
it.
All right.
It's moving. It's living.
One of the downsides of having 3 different screens and limited technical capabilities. So, all right. Well, first of all, I just want to thank the organizers. This is a great opportunity, and hopefully, part of my goal in talking about this research is one to kind of maybe get people thinking at a much bigger scale. So I spend much of my time dealing with analysis at the scale, sort of like what Lucas presented. And Lucas and I have collaborated on many projects over the years, kind of at what I would call the smaller scale or the more technical scale. And this is an attempt to sort of say, well, what do we do once we have all these data? How can we start thinking about particularly Obsidian data in this case, since I'm assuming most people in attendance here, that's the focus. How do we start looking at these at bigger scales and actually making something that tells us something about the past beyond the technical aspects, which again, I don't mean to diminish because I spend most of my time on that side of the world, that side of things. And partly is a selfish goal, and that this is a project that really ramped up about a year ago, got a lot of work done, and then kind of sat aside. And so my hope was by presenting this talk, we'll eventually finally get this published. So that's usually my strategy for most talks is figure out what project has been sitting around long and needs to be done. So, all right. So what I want to do is sort of present this in a sort of a spectrum of scales. And I think it's kind of important to think about data these ways. And so these two here that I just changed to blue after Lucas's talk is kind of the scale that Lucas was focusing on here, which is a technical, analytical, and source assignment scale. And by skipping over this, again, I don't want to diminish the importance of that. I think that is something that people often take vastly for granted, both aspects of this. And hopefully in the discussion, we can talk a little bit more. I liked Lucas's presentation of the sort of 3 models of sourcing. And as he can probably attest, I have a very strong bias against 2 of those 3. So what I want to start thinking about is how do we kind of think about things at bigger scale? So I'm going to go through sort of, most people should be fairly familiar with this, but just kind of examples of increasing scales until we get to this sort of regional. Can you see my pointer here? Hopefully this is coming through. Okay. I'm a pretty animated speaker, so sitting in front of a Zoom screen is hard for me. So I'll move the pointer around a lot to keep focus. So looking at things at the site scale. So this is often where archaeologists are working. And I'm going to give an example here. This is the Harris site. So this is a site excavated by Lucas's department chair at UNLV, Dr. Barbara Roth. And it's a fascinating site. It's here in the central Mimbres Valley in southwest New Mexico. It's an interesting site in that it is a pit house period site, so earlier than most of the focus in the Southwest at the Pueblo period. But unlike almost every other pit house period site in the Mimbres Valley, it doesn't have a Pueblo on top of it. So we have relatively good temporal control. There are lots of pit house sites throughout the Mimbres Valley, but they almost always have massive Pueblos and later buildings on top. So this is a really fascinating site. It was excavated first, I believe, by Emil Howry in the, I don't know when, 50s, 60s. And then Dr. Roth has spent many seasons out there with her work at UNLV excavating these pit houses. And so this is looking at artifact data within the scale of a single site and looking at, in this case, spatial variability. I've certainly worked on sites where we look at temporal variability, but looking at data at that scale can be really interesting. And I'm not going to go too much into the details of what's going on here, but Dr. Roth has noted this, particularly this cluster here, cluster 4, that for many archaeological reasons, in terms of the types of artifacts that are found, and sort of structure of the site, burials within the pit house, other things, is just unique. It seems to be more ceremonially focused. The connections seem to be different, and that plays out in the obsidian here. So the colors in these bar graphs correlate with these colored source areas. And so we see in most of the pit houses dominated by the Mule Creek source, which is kind of the most abundant and easily accessible source, good quality material. But when we get to this other cluster, we see something very different. And the nice thing about these artifacts, you probably can't read the numbers up here, but they're relatively large samples, and all of these are from exact floor contexts. So this is not subsequent fill. These are artifacts that are found between the floor and roof fall or directly in the roof fall itself. So we have pretty good spatial and chronological control on these artifacts, and we can back up that these people have different connections. Now, whether that means they're traveling to the north or they just maintain social connections to the north, it shows that difference. And so I'm kind of skipping over the archaeological implications here, but I think we can all think of many examples at this site scale where we're looking, and I've done similar things in Japan where we're looking at a single site, but looking at it through time. And we can see from, middle Stone Age to late Middle Stone Age, we can see complete shifts in source use. Same site, same location, same sources on the landscape, and the source use flips almost 100% from one source to another through time. So this is a scale I think archaeologists are very familiar with and work at on a regular basis. Moving up a little bigger, this is certainly not a new thing. Even in the Southwest, there are a number of individuals who've worked at this sort of larger scale. Andrew Duff and others working in the northern Southwest, looking at Chacoan regional systems, or Matt Taliaferro and Shackley and others working down in the Mimbres region and looking at things at a larger scale than individual sites. This is what some of my current research. So this is sort of west central New Mexico. Albuquerque would be, let's see, somewhere up in this area. And so town of Magdalena, New Mexico is right off the side of this area. So this is work that started most recently. Sue Eckert and Deb Huntley have been working out in that area, and I joined the project many years ago and looking at obsidian patterns within these sites. And so in this case, we're actually less concerned with the spatial scatter of sites within these, or spatial use of obsidian within these sites. They're all located within a few miles of each other, sort of a 5 to 10 mile radius. But what I'm interested in is the temporal shift. And so again, these colors here focus or illustrate these source areas. So we're combining some sources. I've split, unlike the last one, we've split the northern sources into the Mount Taylor and the Jemez group. But through time, we can see at these early pit house period sites, there's relatively little use of this local source. So this McDaniel tank is a source that was essentially unknown to archaeologists until Phil Letourneau and I started working there about 15 years ago and kind of identified the source and done lots of source studies there. It doesn't get used much beyond this little area, but our interest was how does it influencing source use kind of in the region itself. And you can see through time, particularly in this kind of what would normally be called Pueblo II to Pueblo III period, we see increasing use of this local source. Again, the cultural dynamics that are driving this is sort of what we're most interested in, but this shows that sort of regional scale. You can see this interesting shift here at LA 1178. And this is actually a huge site called Gallina Springs. And this site is almost certainly a migrant site. So people moving from the Four Corners area, the Mesa Verde area, when that kind of region becomes depopulated, likely drought or other social reasons in the late 1200s, it's almost certain that this site is those direct migrants. They came here and built essentially a Mesa Verde Pueblo in the middle of New Mexico. They start making carbon painted pottery. Everything doesn't match the local community. And we see this immediate and drastic shift in source use, whether this is just maintaining these connections to the north or even to some extent maybe material that was brought with them. The short source use shifts. Subsequent to that, this is kind of an interesting case study. We start to see material from Arizona and other places come in. This is a site 1180 located only about 200 yards away from the Gallina Springs site, but slightly post-dates it. So I'll actually be out there in a week and a half excavating, or about 2 weeks out there excavating at this site. to try to get some better dating and kind of understand the connections with this migration. And then we get a later contact period, later Pueblo here that's actually located further off towards the Rio Grande. So again, without going into the archaeology behind this, I think we're all sort of familiar with this scale of analysis, looking at things that either, and again, you can add temporal components to this. We could look at this spatially, but looking at a relatively local area or sort of bounded community. So one of the things that has always intrigued me is how do we go bigger? And how can we start to think about the Southwest? And so what as a whole, and or even larger scales. I work a lot in Hokkaido, thinking, larger island scale analyses. And I always wanted to make a predictive model. This was always one of my goals, was to say, can I make a model that sort of I could just click on any spot in the landscape and get an expected source distribution and then see how it differs from that, right? The goal is not to predict things perfectly. It's to say, what should we see and then see how it differs. Um, so just in terms of how you do this, before I get to the model that we've developed, one of the main and most important things is you have to know the sources. So in the Southwest, we're very fortunate to have had decades of work by Shackley, some individuals working even before then, and many since Shackley's main work starting in the 1980s at the very least. And his dissertation was focused on visiting and sampling these sources and documenting them. And he's done a lot of work for that. And others of us have tried to fill in little gaps. For example, this McDaniel tank source is one of the few that wasn't known. But the Southwest, we're really fortunate in that these sources are very well known. You get into northern Mexico, which is still part of the Southwest, things get a little sketchier. We definitely have more unknown sources in that region. But for the core of the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, we rarely encounter unknown artifacts. So and this is again due to the work of Shackley and others in that region. So you got to know the source as well. And for most parts of the world, this is usually the case. It's a case for Mesoamerica. It's a case in Japan. There are places, East Africa and others where I feel like we can't say this. There's still source work to be done. Okay, so you need to know the sources. Then when it comes to the archaeological data, it takes a lot of work to compile and standardize those data, right? These are projects that have often been done over decades or longer, many decades, and done by different labs in different places. And often you need to standardize the locations, you need to standardize source names, and things like that. Fortunately for us working in the Southwest, we have a lot of that work has been done for us. So the Cyber Southwest project, which has been funded in numerous iterations. It used to be the Southwest Social Networks Project and other things. It's a project led by Barbara Mills at University of Arizona and many, many others. And this project has been focused on compiling ceramic data. So really looking at ceramic types at sites all across the Southwest. And they have, in recent years, been expanding into other data sources, radiocarbon dates, dendrochronology, faunal analysis, and Obsidian has been incorporated into that. And so a large part, they have incorporated much of the work that Steve Shackley has done over the last 30 years on artifacts and into this Cyber Southwest. It is unfortunately, but reasonably, a very biased sample. So their focus was on larger and later Pueblo sites. So we're, somewhat lacking in earlier time periods at smaller sites, individual finds, things like that. But, we'll get with using what we have. And then we've taken that database and added about 5,000 or more samples that I've analyzed here at MUR in the last 10 to 15 years from projects in the Southwest. And the nice thing about these 5,000 samples, it tends to be smaller data sets and from different time periods than the focus of the Cyber Southwest. So even though it's only adding about a quarter more data, it's filling in a lot of gaps that I think help our model quite a bit. So ultimately, what we're dealing with is about 20,000 sourced artifacts with source assignments and site locations. And this just gives you a rough map of our source areas and artifact. And so the red dots are sites, black dots are the known sources. And there's some that aren't named. I'm not sure why they got that way. And we've also clustered sources. So for example, the Jemez source here in northern New Mexico has at least 5 distinct chemical variants that are spatially and geochemically distinct. We're combining those into one. And so I don't mean to, eventually those are interesting to parse out and they provide interesting information, but for this initial scale, we've combined them. Same thing with the Mule Creek source that you'll see a lot. That's at least 3 and probably 4 or more sources. Mount Taylor is 2 chemically distinct sources. So we've combined them when appropriate, looking at things at this spatial scale. So then how do we do this? And this is not something that's entirely new. Other people have done this before. Often it is done with social networks. And this is, I wouldn't say this is often. This is a relatively new thing to start looking at Obsidian data at what I would call sort of regional scales. A good example of this is a paper that was just published by Feynman, Nichols, and Galitko. And they've been working on iterations of this for many years. This one is in Mesoamerica. And interesting, this project blows the scale off of ours. I think they have over 500,000 sourced artifacts that they're incorporating into this. And they have them all, very spatially and temporally controlled. And there they're using network analysis. So I don't want to go, again, I'm not a network analysis specialist, but you're essentially looking at co-similarities of sources present. So when you go to individual sites, what is the percentage of sources there and how similar is that to other ones? And so this creates linkages and nodes and connections based on similarities. The nice thing about this project, again, it's very different than the model we're doing, but it's amazing in the sheer amount of data they have, as well as the temporal control. So they have unbelievable, they can say in couple 100-year increments how these patterns and use of materials change. And I think Mesoamerica is an interesting region for a study like this, because at least I would argue in the Southwest, maybe the Western US, I don't think Obsidian has the same political connotations that it has in Mesoamerica. I think it's much more of an economic commodity. And so I think it's in some ways easier to model in areas where it should make economic sense, right? They're going to use the closest source when available, and you get this diminishing return. In Mesoamerica, I'm not sure how well those models are going to apply because there's social and political connections that move Obsidian around at a very different scale. So I'll come back to this in a minute, but keep in mind this may be something very different. This has been done in the Southwest. So this is a currently, I believe, still unpublished study. It's going to be a book chapter that should be coming out any day now. And so I only have a very early preliminary view of this, so don't cite or quote any of this. But they're doing a similar type of study in the Southwest using only that Cyber Southwest data set. So those 15,000 samples, and trying to understand, through time, and they have good temporal control in many cases, and looking at these social networks that develop. So it's the same basic idea, very interesting. It tells us a lot about the politics and economics and who's connected to who, but not the kind of model I'm looking for here. So again, it's an interesting model. They do incorporate some least cost path analysis into this, but it's sort of complicated. And again, I have a preliminary version, so I'm not exactly sure where they're going with that. So how can we develop a model that looks at using expected versus observed patterns? And this is what we spent a lot of time. This was working with my colleague here, Rob Walker, as well as a postdoc who was here at the time, John Page. And what I wanted to do was try to see, can we create this expected distribution of sources? So what do we need to know, right? And so my thought was, well, let's start quantifying all the variables. So for example, things like the cost of source access. So we could do this by looking at travel costs. And this we spent an unfortunately large amount of time and effort. My plan was to take the whole Southwest and calculate, a least cost path from any point in the whole region to every single source, and then try to model, expected use at every based on least cost path. At some point, I was using government supercomputers and using like half the computational capabilities of the entire U.S. It got to where it was like this is more complex than it needs to be. So let's back up, think about another way to do it. But that's certainly one aspect, right? The cost of getting that material. It's not just a direct line distance, right? Some sources are easy to access, others are not necessarily. And then there's also social and political costs. Crossing ethnic boundaries or entering hostile territory is something that's really difficult to quantify in a model like this, but it probably plays a large part. Raw material accessibility, right? Does somebody have to go and quarry it, or is there stuff on the surface? That's something that we could potentially attempt to quantify, but is very difficult. Same thing with abundance. Not every source has the same abundance of material. Sometimes it's metric tons on the surface. Other times it's scattered pebbles. Nodule size. How do we quantify nodule size, right? That makes a big difference. There are sources in the Southwest that you're lucky if you find golf ball size pieces. Other ones you can find, football and, up to car size pieces without much difficulty. So how do we quantify that into a model like this? As well as nodule shape, right? Just being round versus flat makes a big difference in terms of what you need to make out of that material. And it might totally change the value of one material over another, and certainly quality, right? Just things like, how glassy is it? How well does it flake? Are there internal flaws, inclusions, things like that? So it came to the point where, how do we do this, right? This is too many variables. If we start trying to quantify this, the complexity increases dramatically. And then it really dawned on us, we have 20,000 samples. The people in the past already made these choices, right? They have indicated what sources were most useful, what sources are worth carrying greater distances. So can we create an expected model just based on the artifacts themselves? And while this might seem somewhat circular, hopefully the way we did it will somewhat make sense, that we're using observed artifacts to create the model to then compare back to observed artifacts. But the way we're doing it hopefully makes sense. And so largely this is based on distance decay curves. So most people who have done lithic studies like this are familiar with these typical curves. As you get farther away, you expect less of material. Typically follows this kind of S-shaped curve. And so we did that for every one of the sources individually. So for example, this is, I believe, the Mule Creek source, and looked at sort of distance from the source. Every site has a different distance, and the circle here indicates the number of artifacts from that source. And then what proportion of that assemblage is from that source, right? So if you get, not surprising, when you get really close, the assemblages are almost entirely dominated by Mule Creek. As you get further away, you get to the point where that drops off and you get basically no percentage of Mule Creek. And so we're fitting this curve to each of the sources. And in doing that, we talked about combining source areas. This, again, just a map of the region. For all of the, I don't remember actually what it was now, 20 to 25 different sources groups that we have developed these curves. So for example, the Jemez source here, this is a big caldera in northern central New Mexico, very abundant material, really good quality at most of these sources. Not a big surprise that it has the largest kind of distance decay drop off. At the other extreme, we have sources like this McDaniel tank, which is the little tiny source here, and in its distance decay curve, yeah, you can see here in the arrow, is a pretty rapid drop. And so once you get to be even, I think we have like 2 artifacts that come from more than 80 miles from that source. So that then what we do to develop the model and the expected values is to take every possible location in the Southwest, measure its direct line distance to the source. So this is direct line distance. This isn't using least cost path. And then figure out what proportion of any given source we would expect, normalize that all back to 1, and determine what percentage should we expect to see. And while this, again, seems circular, these patterns are very directional. Certain sources move certain ways. It impacts or it influences the overall economic model, but then when we come to our observed, we're actually dealing with individual directions. And so hopefully this will make more sense here. And so in developing, we basically developed this kind of pixelated model across the Southwest. So I remember if it's every 5 or 10 square kilometers, we picked the central point and calculated this out. This map is simplified in the sense that it's only showing the source that is over 50%. So where you get areas like this, you're getting multiple sources and none of them are more than 50%. So this is a simplified graphical version of the model that underlies this. But you can see there's big sources like Jemez that kind of dominate the whole northeastern Southwest. San Francisco volcanics in the northwest. Mule Creek kind of dominates the center. Sierra Fresnel into northern Mexico. And you do get little sources even right here. And I think this source looks bigger than it really is just because we've sampled a lot from there. We have a lot of data right at the source area. But all these other little sources have contributions, just not enough to sort of overwhelm the map. And the key is directionality is removed. So Jemez will have the same distance decay curve, but it will be influenced, that percentage will be influenced by the conflicting distance decay curve of other sources as you get closer to them. So using that, this is that expected, we then took the archaeological data, essentially created heat maps of individual source distributions, so actual distributions at known sites, and then sort of smoothed that out over the region. Right? So we don't have a perfectly even distribution of sites. Ideally, we'd love to have more sites in Southeast New Mexico. We could fill in gaps, but this sort of approximates what our expectations are if we could extrapolate across those areas. Now, again, as we get more data, this side will change. Our expected may change also, but we expect to see changes in the observed values. And then by just looking at the difference. So you can see already there's some pretty obvious differences. One of them is this right here. If you can see this Jemez material appears in large abundance, kind of all on its own down in southern New Mexico. And this, I'll explain why in a minute, but it's actually geologic reasons for that, not so much cultural. And by looking at these sort of deviations of observed and expected, one source at a time, we can see some kind of interesting patterns. And this work is still very preliminary. We have these, we've sort of thought about some of these. We have not in any way explored this in any great detail, but we see things like I talked about that expectation. So here where it's red, it's more than expected. Blue is less than expected. Um, and so for the Jemez source here, right, we get what we expect up at Jemez. We expect it to be 100%. It is 100% everywhere around Jemez. Interestingly, it's actually this, and I'll talk about that in a second, this shift towards Mount Taylor that's kind of an interesting fact. But this is an example of I think, a geologically derived abundance in that we are calling Jemez this, but in reality, it occurs in secondary deposits all down the Rio Grande Valley. And I think that when you're in the central New Mexico, the secondary deposits are not really useful. They're smaller pieces, they're harder to get. So I think people are preferentially selecting the local sources. But when you get down here, there really isn't abundant source material. And so they're pulling those secondary gravels. And so that's why we see this extra spike of Jemez percentage-wise down in southern New Mexico. Another interesting pattern is this Mount Taylor. So Mount Taylor is a pretty large source that gets used a lot through central and into central New Mexico. But we see this kind of split here where Mount Taylor sort of shows a lot less in this shadow. And I think this sort of Jemez is just surprisingly abundant and seems to move and flow around Mount Taylor. And I think there's cultural reasons for that. And it may be the large samples associated with the Chacoan occupation here that tend to like to use this Jemez source for one reason or another, whether that's cultural or economic is hard to say. But we're seeing interesting patterns here with Mount Taylor that need to be explored. Seeing very complex source use with Mule Creek. So for those who know the archaeology of the Southwest, there's an interesting sort of cultural phenomenon that happens sort of late 1200s into the 1300s, which is the Salado. So whether this is a movement of people or ideas is up for significant debate. But there's this Salado polychrome pottery that occurs across this area, and we think that it's coming from and largely sort of centered around this southeast Arizona and spreads into New Mexico. And so we're seeing a lot more of this Mule Creek than we would expect in these regions, and we think it has to do with those social connections with Salado. So we think there's some interesting cultural dynamics here that are driving this complexity. And then what I'm really interested in is looking at the distribution of little sources. I always think of obsidian movement as kind of like flowing out from big sources. And when that material moves out, what does it do when it hits little sources? And does it kind of create little eddies and backwaters and things? And so that's something I want to explore. And with sources like McDaniel Tank, we have a lot of data, but it's heavily biased in one direction. So we're seeing a lot more of McDaniel Tank kind of off to the west, but that's where we have all that data I presented earlier for the Lion Mountain project. And we don't have much off to the east. So I think the model is just showing some sample biases inherent in this. So again, this is very preliminary, but I think we're seeing some interesting trends. And so one of our goals is, where do we take this? I think that there are many things we can do just in exploring the maps that we showed, looking at sources individually and seeing how does that match up with our archaeological expectations. A big part of this is a temporal component, right? We've got to deal with time. This assumes there's no time factors. And I think that that's the next part, is to sort of break these down into time periods and meaningfully do so. Unfortunately, then we start getting with smaller and smaller samples. So we have to deal with how much small sample are willing to deal with while still adding this temporal component. Why the Southwest works really well, interestingly, it's kind of a bounded system. If you draw a line around kind of the primary area of the Southwest, there's almost no obsidian that comes into there from outside, and almost no Southwest obsidian leaves that region. So with very few exceptions. So it gives us a good thing to model. We don't have sort of weird things that go off in odd directions. We can make a fairly bounded model. I think there are other places where that might be useful. I think Mesoamerica as a whole, that might be the case, where we can kind of take that Feynman and Glico model and treat that as a bounded system. I had really hoped this would work in Hokkaido. I have a graduate student who I think might be on here, Jennifer Cullison, who is going to look into this, doing it in Hokkaido. We have lots of artifacts, good sources, but the problem is those artifacts are from relatively few sites. And when you need good spatial coverage for this model to be meaningful, you can't have 10,000 artifacts, but only from 10 sites. You just got to have better spatial coverage. So Hokkaido may or may not end up panning out. But again, I think that Mesoamerica is maybe an interesting place that Jennifer might try deploying this model and see if we can do it. And there we have the temporal component too. So essentially taking that exact same data set that Feynman and others are using and just plug it into this model and see if it works. So I think that's about all I have. Just want to thank the folks on this team, Rob Walker. I had an undergraduate student, Noah Smelser, and John Page, who was a postdoc at the time working on that. And then all the folks who shared data, and of course, NSF for supplying 30 plus years of funding to the lab that has allowed us to accumulate all these data and work through these. So I think that's about all I have. I'll stop sharing for now.
Thank you so much. That was really exciting, both of the presentations. Are there any questions from the audience? You should ask them, otherwise I will start. And for some who have seen the videos, I don't stop. So
I have
that's
a
your
question.
chance.
I have
I have a
one.
question for Jeff.
Oh, perfect. So I had Lucas first and then Kathy, if that's fine.
Jeff, how small, this is going to sound like an odd question, how small of a regional scale, which seems in opposition, but working, in discrete environments or ecozones within the Mojave that are altitudinally different, with different resources, I'm excited to think about the social network of obsidian sources distributed within a relatively small region, but defined by settlement pattern based off where people might be going to, say, go to pinyon juniper areas versus, canyon areas where there's more water resources, right? Like those are areas where people are traveling for particular purposes, some of which are really far away from obsidian sources. Others are relatively close, but still you're dealing with sort of aggregating mechanisms on the landscape where obsidian can be left behind. But I'm not quite sure my question, but it's an interesting model to follow that begs the question, how big is your region, right? To what extent is a region the Southwest, all of Mesoamerica, or is it a relatively small defined region that has a lot of elevation diversity in it, right? Does that make sense?
I think it's a good question in terms of my thinking is generally how big can we make these, but you're thinking the other way around. How small can we functionally make this model work? I don't think there's a real limit. The problem, I think, is I talked about it being a bounded system. It works well. If you are working within, say, the Mojave and you have, 3 sources, but 40% of your obsidian comes from distant sources outside that, I think it makes the model, it doesn't allow you to develop the model, right? Because you need to have a distance decay curve for all of the sources that are involved. And if your data aren't giving you that information, it may just kind of not work in developing the model. So what you may have to do is almost develop the model at a larger scale that has some kind of bounding. Again, that's the problem with the Western US out of the Southwest. Where would you define a model that you don't get bleed over from California to Nevada to, it's hard to divine to draw those lines that create a bounded region. I don't think so my thinking would be develop it at whatever scale you need to make the model work, and then focus in on what's going on at the smaller scale. Does that make sense? So I think you need to, I don't think there's any reason, for example, we could look just at what the deviations from observed and expected at those sites just in the Lion Mountain area that I presented that one, distribution chart. That in itself could be interesting, but you couldn't develop the model there because the sources are all too distant. And so there are places, for example, I know a little bit about European obsidian, but would the Mediterranean work? Maybe, but could you draw a line that could define enough without getting enough bleed over? I think it's possible, but I just don't know the sources there. So I don't. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm just trying to think through applying this, so yes, exactly. Thank you.
So my hope is to maybe work, and I've talked with Alex Nyers, who has all of Craig Skinner's data, from the Western U.S., particularly kind of Northwest Great Basin, and see if we can throw it in, see what happens, because it's not going to be as perfectly bounded as we can get in the Southwest, but see how it breaks down when we have these regions that have a little bleed over.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe the Caucasian stuff that Ellery was working on and some others could be interesting as well.
Mm-hmm.
Kathy, you had a question.
Yeah, I have a question for Lucas. I'm going back in the weeds, which is my favorite place.
We've met there many times, Kathy.
I know. So you had that table that had standard errors for the different elements, and it said 85 for zirconium. Is that an 85 ppm over prediction for zirconium?
That standard residuals, standard deviation, that's in part per million. Yeah, that's in part per million. But it's
So
not an over prediction. It's the standard deviation measured in part per million of difference from a perfect regression line, right? So that's like the average standard deviation in part per million for zirconium.
That's really high.
It is depending on what the nature of your zirconium line is meant to predict, right?
So, like, do you have some really large zirconium numbers on there?
Well,
like, is there some Mesoamerican stuff or something?
Yeah, there's some zirconium that's almost 2,500 part per million.
Oh, okay, that makes sense then.
Right,
I think Lucas,
certainly 1,500.
And just to clarify, that number that you're giving there, Lucas, that's off just one of the MER standards, right? You've applying it to the full curve, but then measuring one standard multiple times?
No, this is all the standards measured against each other.
Yeah, but there's definitely some high zirconium stuff in there,
Okay,
especially if
that's
you
fine.
included the East African samples that are in the calibration. Those are thousands of parts per million. So.
Right, yeah. That makes sense.
So that's where it's important to understand what is the range that you're trying to predict, and then how these numbers tell you, how good are you doing, right? It's a measure of your model.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Are there more questions?
Hi, I have a question for Jeff, actually, which might be kind of annoying in an XRF meeting, but I guess I'm wondering if you think that your model could be applied to NAA data from like known compositional groups or a similar model.
It's an interesting idea. I think there are very few places where we have enough data that I'll think about a place where that might be with precise enough production locations, right? As you're well aware with NAA data, it's often it was made in the upper Gila. Well, how do you create a point for that then measures distances and decay? Now, interestingly, the Members Valley might be an exception to that in that we have 40 or 50 compositional groups that do probably represent, maybe not point sources, but we could identify in some cases individual pueblos. So it's an interesting idea. Could we create an observed versus expected model? Again, I think those potteries exchange. The nice thing in the Southwest is I think Obsidian is moving largely for economic reasons, and so it's going to follow this distance decay, whereas certain pottery types and exchanges reflect probably much more complex social interaction. So I don't know, but that's an interesting idea. And Members data might be one of the few places we could do that. Again, you'd have to have that sort of tight control over production to look at that. So it's an interesting idea. Sounds like it should be a chapter for your dissertation, but.
Well, thank you.
And full disclosure, Tuesday is one of my graduate students. So.
You just gave her more work. Well done.
I've only given her like 12 dissertation topics so far. So.
It sounds like she gave herself that work.
That's true. That's self-inflicted wound there.
Thanks.
More questions? Yeah, Ina, please go ahead.
Hi there. Thanks for the talk. Jeffrey, also for you. Your fall off curves, they reminded me of a rather old paper now by Ian Hodder on pottery, Oxfordshire pottery in England. And he demonstrated that the fall off curve was much less steep where water applies. So, the pottery would travel longer
Mhm.
distances. And so therefore the 50% mark that sort of you're looking at would be moving much, much further away. I mean, I presume there isn't that much water in the dry part of that region, but maybe there are other factors that might impact. I'm thinking uphill, downhill, anything to do with the ocean, depending on how close things get. Um, is there anything that you can spot? Because obviously you had different angles for the fall of curves that might hint at some aspects of this.
Yes. So it's an interesting question. And again, this gets back, I think that difference of our initial idea of trying to create this idealized model where we quantify everything and then develop expectations off of cost to acquire, all of the other variables, the quality. And I think that's where it just gets too complex. And so by using the actual archaeological distributions, we show how people already made those choices. I don't know if that makes much sense, but there are places so that overall distance decay curve reflects actual use, not just what we expect. Then when we look at the observed, what we're looking at is a very directionally specific. So how does it interact, in particular, interacting with other sources? But I think there are certainly ways, is there a mountain range? I mean, the Colorado Plateau is a significant factor in movement north and south in the Southwest. The Rio Grande itself is maybe somewhat of an impediment. Maybe it's actually easier to move up and down the Rio Grande Valley. So I tend to look to social reasons when I see major differences in observed and expected, but there are certainly geographic and other factors. I mean, I don't think there's a whole lot of water transport in the Southwest. You could sort of float a boat in the Rio Grande on a good day, but they're not doing major. We don't find Southwestern canoes for a reason. Um, and so I think that's a possibility. I showed that one example where the geology itself has impacted it, right? We get these secondary sources of Jemez material way in southern New Mexico, and that shows up as an odd blip that we don't expect. So I think you're in the right correct direction, and maybe I tend to jump to cultural explanations when there could be more geographic ones or other factors that influence it. Um, but yeah, that's certainly a part of it that we need to consider.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to make a note to look up that Hodder reference. So
Any more questions?
on an odd Ian Hodder side note, did anybody who was at the SAAs notice that he was auctioning off his old briefcase? In the which I thought was hilarious. It was up to he called it the post-processual briefcase. They do a fundraiser auction at the Society for American Archaeology meetings for the Native American Scholarship Fund, and he had his old briefcase in there for auction. I think when I checked early on, it was already to like $200, but I don't know what it ultimately went for. So it was called the post-processual briefcase or something like that. And
So we all need to get famous so we can sell our old
that's
briefcases
right.
for that.
Yeah, I thought about putting mine in there. For the longest time, I actually used to compete since I make pottery. I used to compete with Schiffer in selling my stuff compared to his. Because he could put anything in there and it would sell for $100, and I would put the most beautiful piece in there and I could hardly get it sold. And finally, one year I beat him and never haven't let
Yay!
him live it down.
We all need goals.
And I don't mean I beat him because I'm more famous. It was just finally my stuff was finally selling for enough. And so, yeah.
Congratulations.
I'll ask, I have a question for Jeff. Have you thought about applying this kind of model to California? We have, especially the coast, the southern coast, you have few sources. You get Casa Diablo, um, Napa, and Coso, basically, but a lot of sites.
It might be. I think you almost need enough sources to make it complex enough. So again, there you kind of have a bounded model, right? You're not getting a lot of the
Right.
Eastern Nevada or Western Nevada, Eastern California material. But when you only have three sources, I'm not sure how well the model would work when you're dealing with that scale, right? So we designed this to work really well in the Southwest. And I think it works there when you've got 10 to 30 sources and hundreds of sites spread around. I don't know when you start pushing the limits of that model. Again,
Mm.
we push the limits in Hokkaido where we have too few sites, and it just
Mhm.
fails. You just get weird expectations that don't make any sense, and the model falls apart. I think this one, it may fall apart not because of a lack of archaeological data, but because too few sources. But it's worth a try, and maybe that's something that Jennifer, my student, could work on, is just trying to plug the model into other regions and just see where it works rather than working on one region in particular. Just see, can this
Mhm.
model like this even work in certain places?
Mm. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's the second task handed on. You're doing well tonight, or your morning.
Yeah.
So already done the things for the day.
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, that's what grad students are for.
So speaking of, as you said before, some of the, like, in some places it doesn't work because you just have too few sources. Do you know yet how, like, what is the minimum number of sources that you need in order to,
No. So like I
another
said, we've
thing?
tried this in the Southwest and we've tried it in Hokkaido. One seems to
Yeah.
work, one seems to fail, but that's where it might be interesting. And I don't know, maybe we could even test this theoretically, just invent a region, invent some data, and make up data and try and see what the thresholds of different variables are.
Mhm.
I think that's interesting. My inclination is just to try it where we have data and see if it works, but that could be an
Or
interesting idea. Yeah.
or even like with the data set that you already have, start like removing things until it stops working.
Right.
Like,
Yes. Yeah, I think that's interesting. We definitely see weird stuff going on the edges. So if you move, when you look at predictions, once it works well in the source area, but when you start getting like into northeast New Mexico where we have few sites and little source data, the whole model kind of blows up and
mhm.
gets kind of funny, but that's to be expected. So, yeah, but I like the idea of actually doing some simulations and maybe trying it. This is where Rob Walker, my colleague here at MU, comes into play because the modeling and doing the actual computational side is not my expertise at all.
Thank you, Ina. Ina put the
Thank
other
you. I just saw
reference
that.
in the chat. All right, then I would have a question for Lucas, unless Lucas wants to ask Jeff something.
Uh, no, go ahead. I think I want to ask Jeff something offline with a research question. So it's not pertinent to the group discussion, but it might be for a student of his. Please.
There are things happening you're not telling us. All right, then keep it a secret. That's
Well,
fine.
I'll ask in the group after this thing, just
All
so
right.
there aren't any
No worries, no worries.
any exclusives.
Don't don't be teased by me. So,
Okay.
no, I was wondering, going back to your statistics you were talking about, that we should monitor specific types of values. I was wondering, based on what Kathy was saying earlier, that the 85 seems to be very high. What are the benchmarks? So do you use benchmarks to define this is fine, I'm going to use that because the standard error of the residues is fine, or because the slope is okay, but I don't use these ones because I don't trust them? Or is it more a kind of, I feel this is off based off of my knowledge of data and not go for the strict benchmark approach?
Well, I haven't established any benchmarks. I haven't really worked with the rental equipment and the Vanta that much to say, hey, this is what I really feel confident in. I'm running through this to see where my comfort level is, and to some extent, I feel comfortable just opening up the case and shooting because I can still source something, but there's clear problems when you start to insert a lot more source diversity rather than just 5 varieties. The area that this research in has upwards of 15 to 20 sources that could be in the area. So that I would imagine will get pretty ugly pretty quick. And so the numbers that are coming that I showed probably showing too much error that need to be better understood, that will reflect back into the actual artifact analysis. The goal here was to just get a baseline of what the error is and how that might influence the artifact and source analysis. And in referring back to something that was seminal, right? Something that was published 20 years ago, that was the state of the art thing, right? Is it still the state of the art today? Right? Can we still compare back to it, or do we need to think through the errors in that analysis, right? Like, what were their errors? Well, I don't know. They didn't tell me. They just told me their results, right? So some of this is an exercise in disclosure, transparency, and analysis to know what your assumptions are, and to say, hey, you know what? This is actually not too bad, or this is way off, right? I can't even use a publication because the error in the instrument is too big. All those things fed into the iterative process of, do I feel confident enough to go to the next step? Do I feel confident enough to go to the next step after that, right? If these errors were so large, I would have never even thought about comparing it to a publication, because I knew the assumption of the instrument were way off from what all the analysis MER has done, right? All the publications that they've put out, so that we trust the data coming out of that laboratory, right? Those published numbers. So some of this is an exercise in transparency and data disclosure. So we can understand what that bar is. Maybe what I showed is an adequate bar for my study area. But the more I drill in and analyze, hundreds or thousands of artifacts, that error might be too big. And we need some internal consistencies and some tweaks to feel more confident.
Thank you.
Lucas, can I add a little something to what you're saying? And I think I have a different approach than others, and I've been told this in publications. But I feel pretty strongly about this. I think this goes back to what I was noting Lucas's sharing data. And I think he's doing this in a way, in sort of comparing to previously published data, that is actually okay to do. I mean, you know the limitations. The problem is most people don't. And I would strongly discourage, I cannot discourage you strongly enough to not use published data when you're doing this. That most XRF instruments are internally precise enough, regardless of accuracy, to allow you to assign sources, as long as you're using the same instrument and same settings and same calibration. And I think that's critical. And as archaeologists, we need to remember what's important, right? I couldn't care less what the niobium concentration of a particular source is. That's as an archaeologist, right? That's not the meaningful information. Now, it doesn't mean it isn't important, and I try to get good numbers, but it's the source assignment that's archaeologically meaning, right? That's the only thing that really, getting a correct source assignment is what should be driving this. So to get to your question about error rates, to me, I would look at it as what your goal is, right? If you're working in an area that has 3 sources and they're all vastly different chemically, you can probably accept a larger error range if you know that you can still get those source assignments than if you're working in an area like with the COSO stuff, where you've got 4 or 5 sources that are all chemically distinct, or Obsidian butte, and you need to have that level of precision. So the idea of that you have a set, 4% error rate is considered not good, maybe or maybe not. I think it's entirely situational, and you need to know that situation more. So,
Thank you. Thank you for adding that. I'm working on pottery, so I'm coming kind of from that area. And I'm really interested in all those things about defining precision and accuracy, because I feel it's really important, especially with pottery, where we have all those biases already. And there is a publication coming up called Innovations in, I should know that because I'm one of the editors. It's about methodological innovations in p-XRF studies, which was a conference in 2024. And there is an article in there on defining benchmarks for device performance, but also precision. And there are 2 articles in there on comparing data from different devices and what could be a way of dealing with that. And there are a couple of people in the network working on those approaches, how to work with data from different devices, how to define precision and accuracy. And I feel it's even a step forward if we get people to document their device performance based on standards like the Merkit for Obsidian or the bricks or whatever for pottery. And we just learn to understand better the performance of our devices, to understand those biases that we have in there, to understand, is this value good enough or not? If we can compare between different devices, different questions, when do we make which decision, which I feel is still something, especially when you start out in p-XRF studies, we are really, really struggling with, because there is no guidance on that.
When I got contacted from the county museum in Southern California, they had bought an instrument 2.5 years ago and really never turned it on. And so my first question was, does it work? Right? And they were like, well, we don't know. We don't even know how to establish if it works or not. So, and if it turns on, how well does it do? Right. So starting from that process of, it helps you establish a little street cred when you're like, hey, at least I've got a good R² line, right? My slope is good. Something's okay here. Okay, now I feel confident that I can make the next step. Now, what are my other limitations? So, some people are beginning right at the beginning to know how well stuff is. So, having those benchmark maybe procedures as opposed to numbers is an important thing to iterate to the community.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just to clarify,
sorry.
what I was saying is it applies specifically to Obsidian or other very homogeneous point source material. Yeah, when you start working with other, for you, the chemistry actually really matters, right? In Obsidian sourcing, the chemistry is just a tool to figure out the source. And so you need to use that tool appropriately and know what the limits are. But when, in your case, yeah, you're looking at the chemistry, and that's a very different thing. Not that Obsidian study isn't looking at chemistry, but that's, again, not the focus, is not the elemental compositional data.
Yeah,
Right.
there we're also getting into that area of different requirements for different materials just due to their geological background and how they can be messed with or not by humans. And they mess with pottery. They mess with the clays and everything else in a way they can't do with Obsidian. So there we
Those
go.
darn humans.
Yeah, when I teach archaeometry, I always contrast Obsidian with pottery, and I say Obsidian is really easy. People can't do anything to mess it up. Pottery is exactly the opposite. Every person in the history of the world has done everything they can to make pottery as complicated as possible. And geology is working against you. People are working against you. Diagenesis is working against you. Yeah.
But we still can do it. I'm a strong believer that it's working, and it's also working for pottery. It's just, it needs a lot more, not only knowing the device, but also the material and what we can really save from it. Which doesn't mean that Obsidian studies are easy. They are just different, and you can do different things with it. And very, very lovely statistics you can't do with pottery. So, or the distribution maps you can try, but it's much better with Obsidian. But yeah, I really love your slide, Lucas, where you show this is the way you can just basically check if the device is running in proper parameters, because this is what I feel, really need. So
when I talked with some manufacturers, most recently with the Olympus folks, when I told them I was going to do all this, they're like, why? And I said, well, because I don't trust you, because, and it's not that you don't trust humans, and, but it's something that's easily accessible, and that we have to run it through its paces, right? You have to make sure you test drive the car before you buy it. And for me, working at an agency that doesn't have a lot of money, or at a university, it may not have a lot of money, but you can rent things, right? You can get access to things here and there. having that methodology, ready at hand, so you get something, run it through its paces, and go, I trust it. Something's wrong, you send it back. You tweak it. I think that that's a really important thing to understand. Certainly for the museum people who had money 2.5 years ago to buy a $30,000 piece of equipment, but have no idea how to use it, and they're relying on us, right, as the academic, as the user community, to inform them how to do that. So we have a responsibility to tell them what their limitations are, because their sales rep is simply going to say, it works, don't worry, just buy it, it's cool, right? And that's what they were told, that they could use it on any material in their museum, which is true. But how effective will it be in using it on any material in their museum? That's what they didn't understand, because they're not geochemists. They're not really even conservationists. They're just managers. So those are things that I always keep at the forefront of my mind.
Yeah. And I'm really grateful for that, because this is also what the network is about. We know that there are many people out there that just get handed a device, and it's not even their fault. It's just they're in a position where they get it handed over, and then they should do something. It's students, it's people in museums. I'm in the lucky position that we are at a research museum here, and I was involved in getting the new Pantamax that just arrived a couple of days ago. So I'm really excited in running all the tests. But yeah, very often people really start with that. There is a device, I have a task, and I don't know anything about it. So having something like you did is really laying the groundwork. And Keelie, you might need to help me there, but also connected to this lecture series, there is an opportunity to publish fee-free in the journal of the Academy. So if you're interested to publish one of your presentations, Jeff or Lucas, you're very, very welcome to. We can send you the details, because it would be amazing to have those talks also written down for people to refer to, and especially these are the things you can do with this kind of analysis, or these are the steps you should take. I think we really still need that.
Are there workshops out there that would be available to people like that in the community? Like Jeff, is that something that you guys do? Say p-XRF workshop.
No, I do a lot of individual training. So when people come here, bring their instruments, we work together. MERG does host workshops. Lately, they've been kind of regional focused. So I think we had one last summer on Andean archaeology, and people come out and spend a week. Usually it's NAA focused. I think there's a similar one we have planned for this fall for Mesoamerica. But that's not something that's impossible to do. But I think it's easier just work directly, and I'm happy to help however I can.
Yeah, we just had the p-XRF conference of the global p-XRF network here in Vienna. And one of the main points that came up there is that we still miss those learning opportunities, workshops, summer schools, opportunities for people to come together, ask their questions, and just really learn it from the beginning. This is the device. This is how I turn it on. These are the steps I take. This is what I do with the data. This is how I check it. Really starting from scratch. And this is something people really wish for. So if somebody is interested in giving a workshop like that, just let us know. Keelie and I are always happy to hear about that, because we also know we're global. So having one in Europe might help a couple of people, but really not all of us. So
also, part of the, I think, reason why maybe it's not so institutionalized at the moment is because, as we've mentioned before, XRF on Obsidian, very different from XRF on ceramics. So it's also, I think, a matter of, okay, is someone interested in doing this? Part of the benefit of the network is, okay, how can I get in contact with people who might also be interested in doing something like this, and then potentially be able to collaborate. So if that is something that you want to do, then obviously I have a very long mailing list at the very least. We can start to try and figure out how to go about doing that and making that more structured in a way that is accessible, in a way that XRF maybe hasn't been in the past. Different from some other sort of techniques, like, I know that like a lot of universities have maybe like summer courses on micromorphology that happen, relatively regularly and things like that. So, yes.
I wanted to ask my question to Jeff before we hang up, like I promised to do for Michaela. So the Obsidian volume that I made reference to, and Kathy knows this too, they do have percentages, proportions by particular region. And I wonder if it might be wise to maybe collaborate with one of your students, if time is allowable, to see if there's a publication buried in that literature where that doesn't require any more new data. It just requires a rethinking of 20-year-old data in the model that you propose.
Sounds like an interesting test to me. Yeah, we just need to get the data, and again, I think there's a lot on the computational side that I'm not capable of doing, so I need to make sure that my collaborators can do that, or that Jennifer can get up to the speed where she can do it on her own. I'm not sure either of those are a guarantee, but hopefully soon we will be able to do that. That's my goal. I think me learning how to do it is probably the least efficient way to do this, because it involves a lot of R coding that I'm miserable at, but it's certainly an interesting idea and a possibility.
But we love R.
I love it. I just can't do it. So,
would it be too much to ask for you to email me that student's contact info, and we can have a little side conversation?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'll send it to you in a minute.
Right now, we're trying to rethink our historic context and how to really operationalize the Obsidian data in a research way, rather than just it be something that was really cool 20 years ago, but isn't really applicable anymore, which is untrue, because it really demands our creativity to make it applicable, rather than collecting new data to make it applicable, right? So that's where my brain is in reusing already existing in new ways.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Any more questions? Then, Keelie, I would hand on to you for the final remarks and announcing the next colloquium.
Okay. So thank you so much for being here, everybody. We really appreciate you. We appreciate, obviously, always having a very nice discussion towards the end. I will just remind everyone that our next colloquium is going to be on May 27th. And the time is a little bit different. It will be at 1 p.m. because we are accommodating Australia and the US. So we had to find over your lunch break, perhaps, if you would like to join us if you're in Europe. It is 1 p.m. CET, and that is between Robin Torrance and Mark Glitko, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. So they are both people working in Papua New Guinea. Should be very exciting, very interesting. So if you have the time, we would love to see you again in just a couple of weeks. And I think that's it. I think we can call it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody.
It's Obsidian again. It's Obsidian again next week. Next meeting, it's Obsidian again. Yeah.
If anyone has any interest in
it's a good place.
Giving some talks on some other materials, reach out to me. I believe my email is on all the posters. I would be so happy to organize something else. But for those that love Obsidian, we're also happy to have things for you.
Can you make sure I get added to that list? I'm not sure I've seen advertisements of this much before. So
yes, we can. I can make sure that you get all the information about how to get added to the XRF mailing list for the network. And I think also the Academy has one specifically as well, so I can get that out to you guys
cool.
for sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I would like to be added too.
Oh, okay. Okay, wait, Kathy, do yours. I'm just going to write your name down, and then I will find
Okay.
you somewhere on the internet.
Okay. Thanks very much.
No
Thank you
worries.
all. Thank you
Thank
for
you
your
all.
interest.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for the presentations.